affirmative task we have now is to actually create a new world order. A new world order. A new world order.
We bring the world new order.
From the ashes of World War I, Adolf Hitler attempted to build a sinister new world order. Led by a so-called race of Aryan supermen, spreading a reign of terror unlike any the world had ever known. Many believed the Nazis conjured strange spirits and followed occult practices that had lain dormant in Europe for thousands of years. Now documents prove that their beliefs were based on a perversion of ancient pagan law, a twisting of mythic battles between forces of light and darkness, and a terrifying journey into a world ruled by mystics, madmen, and murderers. His inner circle, who had strong ties to the occult, would help him to accomplish this goal. Among them were Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess, whose correspondence reveals a devotion to astrology and forecasting by the stars. Nazi Commissioner for Philosophy and Education Alfred Rosenberg, who wrote the book laying out the tenets of the Nazi religion. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's Minister of Propaganda, whose diary records his use of astrological forecasts in planning the war against the Allies. And Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS and the Nazi death camps, whose personal papers reveal that he was the master occultist of the Third Reich and ultimately the architect of the new Nazi religion. At the foundation of this new religion was an ancient occult legend that tells the story of a continent somewhere in the North Atlantic. There lived a race of super beings who had fallen from grace through evil and vice. A great flood wiped these beings off the face of the earth. But before they could all be destroyed, certain priests escaped by boat, eventually finding their way to India and the high peaks of Tibet. These escaped priests, believed by mystics to be the original race of Aryan godmen, were said to be the ancestors of all Indian and European people. The land was called Atlantis. Certain German mystics claimed the Atlantis myth was actual history. Their proof that Aryans were the chosen people descended from the super beings of Atlantis, and that they had lost their powers by mating with mere mortals. In these theories lay the seeds of Nazi doctrine. Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler, an extreme nationalist, made it his mission to prove that the Germanic peoples were the descendants of the Atlantic master race.
Because the global order is changing again. And the institutions and rules that worked so well in the post-World War II era for decades, they need to be strengthened. And some have to be changed. So we have to do what we do best. We have to lead. We have to lead. We have to update the global rules of the road. We have to do it in a way that maximizes benefits for everyone, because obviously it's overwhelmingly in our interest. This is not a zero-sum game. It's overwhelmingly in our interest that China prosper, that Mongolia prosper, that nations big and large, east and west.
Now, as you know, the title of this presentation is The Grand Design. But I should explain at the outset that the real subject behind this title is U.S. foreign policy. Now, I realize that there are some who might think that I was trying to be funny or sarcastic with that statement, because for a long time there's been a generally accepted view that our foreign policy has been so bungled and confused that it couldn't possibly have followed any design, much less a grand one. Ladies and gentlemen, the purpose of this presentation is to show not only that there is a grand design, but that it has been the consistent, dominant force behind absolutely every major move by the United States in the foreign policy field since at least the end of World War II. This grand design has provided the motivation for all we have done in the past, and unless some basic changes are made, it will determine everything we shall do in the future. Now, regardless of one's opinion of this grand design, it's the outgrowth of a powerful and compelling argument, a profound statement of philosophy, and a deceptively attractive appeal to reason. And ladies and gentlemen, unless we are able to counter this argument and to offer a superior philosophy, we'll continue to be like putty in the hands of its advocates. So it's important, to say the least, for us to understand what the grand design is, to analyze it in order to discover its flaws, if any, and then to offer a superior alternative if we can. These three requirements, then, will constitute the general outline of the material and the ideas to be presented here. First, identification. Second, analysis. And third, solution. Now, to plunge right into the core of this challenge, what I'm going to do now is advocate the grand design just as though I really believed in it, which in all honesty, at one time I did. In fact, I'm going to teach it to you, just the way it was taught to me at the University of Michigan. Now, following the form of what we might call an extended syllogism, here is how the argument begins. 1, we are living in a new age. And of course, you can't hardly argue with that. We're always living in a new age. But nevertheless, we're reminded of that profound fact rather elaborately. We're living in an age of marvelous and incredible technological advances. An age in which men travel faster than the speed of sound, in which satellites forge communication links between continents, in which space itself has become a limitless frontier of exploration. And then, at the end of the list of all these wondrous and productive scientific achievements, always we are reminded, with ominous overtones, that we also have something with us now called the bomb. End of step 1, ready now for step 2. By the way, everything up to this point not only is true, it's so obviously true that it's really not part of the argument at all. It's merely thrown in at the beginning as a kind of conditioner to get us nodding our heads in agreement in hopes that the habit will carry over into the next step, which is where the going gets tricky and where we need to be far more on our guard. The next step, then, the real premise of the grand design, is this. If all-out war should develop today between major powers, both sides would lose. No one could come out ahead in that kind of a war. Everyone would lose. It wouldn't make any difference who the good guys were or who the bad guys were. It wouldn't make any difference who started it, or even if it were started by accident. Both sides would lose. All right, now having acknowledged the existence of the bomb, and having concluded that risking war is unthinkable in this modern age, we move now to step number 3, which is this. Since the communists have nuclear weapons, and since they certainly would use them in their own self-defense, that means, doesn't it, that victory over communism is impossible. Now, we may wish that it were possible. We may wish that we were living in a bygone era in which if one had an enemy, he could meet him on the open battlefield and get it over with. We may wish that a lot of things were different in this old world. But instead of moaning and weeping and longing after those things which are no longer possible, let's grow up be mature, intelligent human beings and face life the way it really is. Rather than living in a fantasy world, dreaming and longing after those things we want but can never have, instead, let's find out what is the best we can get and then work for that. All right, now the next step. It's not enough for us just to know that victory is impossible. For our own safety, we must conduct our foreign affairs in such a way as to reflect this knowledge to the other side. We must be extremely careful never to give the enemy any cause to question our benign intent. We must avoid using any words or committing any acts which might even suggest that we were pursuing a goal of victory. We can't afford to gamble on what the enemy might do in response. In other words, we mustn't frighten the communists or give them any cause for self-defensive panic. In fact, to take it one step further, we must avoid the temptation even to embarrass the Soviets in the eyes of the world. You see, the argument is that it's like being locked in a cage with a dangerous animal. You can't get out of the cage, and you can't kill the animal. So what do you do when it becomes hungry and restless? You feed it, hoping that if it's full and comfortable and contented, then it won't eat you.
Obviously, it's overwhelmingly in our interest. This is not a zero-sum game. It's overwhelmingly in our interest that China prosper, that Mongolia prosper, that nations big and large, east and west.
Well, the people who have created U.S. foreign policy over the past 2 decades view the United States as being locked in a worldwide cage with a dangerous animal called communism. We can't get out of the cage, obviously. And since victory is impossible, remember, we can't destroy the animal. So, to minimize the chances of communism turning on us, these planners not only have avoided frightening the animal with any overt moves which it might mistakenly view as a threat to itself, but they've done everything possible to keep the beast fed, comfortable, and content. It's in our own interest, they say, to see that communist regimes remain reasonably stable. If they need wheat or other agricultural commodities, send it to them. If they need industrial know-how, invite their scientists and engineers to tour our factories so they can learn how best to produce. If they still can't manufacture the goods they need, then send our own people over there to build their plants and set up their production lines. If that doesn't work, then sell the products to them on easy credit terms and don't really expect to get paid. In fact, if they need money, give that to them too. Give them anything they need so they won't become restless and aggressive. And yes, as harsh as it may seem on the surface, it's even in our best interest to see that communist regimes can successfully put down internal anti-communist revolts. Now, none of this because we're pro-communist, only because we're mature, objective, intelligent people who recognize that in this modern nuclear age, we can't afford the risk to our own survival, which would be inherent in having so powerful an adversary struggling defensively to maintain his position. All right, we're ready now for the final step in the grand design, which concerns itself with the question of realistic, attainable goals. What is the best we can hope to achieve in this new age with all of its complexities? How do we resolve this dilemma before we all go up in a mushroom cloud of nuclear dust? The answer that is offered to us is this. We should encourage the communist world gradually to move toward us, ideologically, politically, and economically, while at the same time we must be willing to move toward them, ideologically and economically, to the point where, hopefully in the not-too-distant future, we'll be able to merge our system with theirs, and of course with those of the rest of the world, to form some kind of a world brotherhood, a world union, a world government, to be exact, which by definition would hold a monopoly over all these weapons of mass destruction, and then nuclear war between nations finally would be impossible, for the simple reason that there no longer would be any nations, including our own. There would remain only a group of disarmed political subdivisions of an all-powerful world government. Of course, the grand designers scoff at the suggestion that such a concentration of power in one place might ideally be suited for a total consolidation of control into the hands of a small group of power-hungry world politicians. They particularly scoff at the possibility of this power falling into communist hands through the tactics used so successfully by their agents working within every other coalition government in which they've ever participated. We're assured that since this would be a world coalition government, for that reason the communists wouldn't try to seize power. They'd be content merely to share in it. Well, without going into that particular little fantasy, just for the sake of discussion, let's grant the point and assume that a world coalition government with the communists really would result in a merger of our systems rather than the domination of theirs over ours. What then? Well, first of all, we would have to be willing to give up certain things that we would rather retain, such as our sovereignty and our independence. In other words, we must be willing to abide by the political dictates of the majority of other nations. One man, one vote in a world democracy. We must merge our monetary system with those of other nations, eventually to form a world currency.
The conference could see plenty of finger-pointing, as you can imagine. Many European leaders are placing the blame for the global economic crisis on the United States and a lack of regulation specifically on Wall Street. Now, this could present a major roadblock in global trade deals, as the World Trade Organization predicts a 10% drop this year already without some of these tensions. In the meantime, Pope Benedict XVI, he's also weighing in, calling for G8 leaders to create a new world financial order.
Pope Benedict XVI is calling for a new world financial order. In the third encyclical of his pontificate, Benedict denounced the profit-at-all-cost mentality of the globalized economy, and he lamented that greed brought about the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. The document, entitled Charity and Truth, was released just hours before the G8 summit gets underway in Italy.
We have seen the consequences of a globalization where the market has to find by itself the regulations and the rules, and we have seen the disaster that has been over the last year.
The Pontiff stressed that he is not opposed to a globalized economy, saying that if done correctly, it has unprecedented potential to redistribute wealth around the world. But he did warn if globalization continues on the current path, modern societies risk increased poverty, inequality, and further environmental damages.
I think that for sure the Pope thinks that globalization without a soul and without a link with veritas, with truth, is at a high risk.
Mark Hamrick, The Associated Press.
We must willingly submit all international disputes to a world Supreme Court.
A new threat tonight to this country's judiciary system and our national sovereignty, all thank you to the World Court. The World Court is now demanding the United States halt the executions of more than 50 Mexican citizens now on death row. The first of those scheduled executions is that of an illegal alien gang member convicted of the rape and murder of 2 young teenage girls. Lisa Sylvester has our report.
The International Court of Justice in The Hague ordered the United States to take all measures necessary to ensure 5 Mexican nationals on death row in the U.S. are not executed, pending the World Court's decision on their cases. One of them, Jose Medellin, was convicted of brutally raping and killing 2 Texas teens. He's scheduled to be executed in Texas on August 5th. Mexico brought the case to the International Court, saying Medellin and the other Mexican nationals were not told of their right under the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations to contact the Mexican consulate upon arrest. Lawyers representing the government of Mexico in a statement responded to the decision, saying, "We are confident the United States and the state of Texas will comply with the ICJ's order and stay the August 5th execution of Mr. Medellin." But the White House did not indicate how it would proceed.
ICJ issued a preliminary decision. It's something that we're reviewing now, so I don't have anything more for you on it.
Previously, the Bush administration had asked the state courts to give the Mexican nationals new trials, but the U.S. Supreme Court said the White House does not have the authority to compel the states to act. The Washington Legal Foundation represents the family of one of the Texas girls killed. Richard Samp says the World Court can issue any ruling it wants, but from a practical standpoint, it has no real jurisdiction over state criminal matters.
There is no other court in the world, no other national court in the world that has permitted the World Court to second-guess its criminal proceedings. So the idea that the United States ought to allow it to interfere here, I think, is unwarranted.
And a short while ago, CNN received a statement from the Texas Attorney General's office in which they stated, quote, Texas is bound not by the World Court, but by the U.S. Supreme Court, which reviewed this matter and determined that the convicted murderer's execution shall proceed. The Texas Attorney General also noted that there have been 15 years of appeals delaying justice for the victims' families. Lou?
Lisa, thank you very much. Lisa, the U.S. Supreme Court today heard arguments over the death penalty conviction of an illegal alien from Mexico in the brutal rape and murder of 2 teenage girls in Texas. The highly unusual case involves President Bush. The president now wants to stop the execution of the Mexican citizen, even though President Bush presided over more than 150 executions while he was governor of the state of Texas.
And abide by those decisions, regardless of the outcome. And above all, we must turn over our most powerful weapons and even our armies to international control, so that the new world government will possess sufficient military might to compel the various political subdivisions by force, if necessary, to comply with the dictates of its laws and the decrees of its court. Now, to be sure, we'd prefer not to have to do any of these things, because obviously if we're going to merge with other countries, other cultures, other legal systems and political ideologies, we can't expect the whole world to adopt our way of doing things. It'll be a give and take situation in which we'll have to seek a common denominator, a middle ground between our way of life and the way things are done in other parts of the world. And of course, the result of such a compromise of systems predictably would have to be a mixture of the volatile dictatorships of Latin America, the tribal customs of newly emerging Africa, and the socialist regimes of Europe and Asia. Add to this concoction the necessity to absorb the doctrines and methods of communist regimes, and it's rather obvious that we're just going to have to give up certain cherished traditions and customs and learn to adjust to a way of life substantially different from that which we inherited. But it won't be so bad. We'll get used to it, and future generations won't know the difference. Besides, we really don't have any choice in the matter. It's that or the bomb. So let's get on with the job of putting an end to our own nationhood, as it has been historically defined. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the men who have formulated this grand design consider themselves to be part of the intellectual elite. In other words, in their opinion, they're just a little smarter than the rest of us. They feel that the average American doesn't quite have the intelligence or the aptitude to understand the wisdom of their grand design. And in this way, the grand designers are confident that the American people will remain satisfied that their leaders are really standing firm and doing all that is humanly possible. But in reality, ladies and gentlemen, they're merely buying time. It's their plan that the old-timers among us, those of you who have been raised with those old-fashioned and outmoded concepts of patriotism and love of country, that in time your generation will pass away, or at least become the minority voice. And at the same time, they're catching the younger generations coming up through the high schools and the colleges, like they caught me. And the grand designers are confident that in just a few more years, especially if they can lower the voting age, the political majority of the American people can be conditioned to accept the total abandonment of our national sovereignty. If you've been wondering why it is that we can't seem to win any wars against the communists, it's simply because it's our policy not even to embarrass them much less to defeat them. In 1963, the United States Arms Control and Disarmament Agency financed a report by the Peace Research Institute, published in April of that year. And here is what our tax dollars produced. Whether we admit it to ourselves or not, we benefit enormously from the capability of the Soviet police system to keep law and order over the 200 million Russians and the many additional millions in the satellite states. The breakup of the Russian Communist Empire today would doubtless be conducive to freedom, but would be a good deal more catastrophic for world order. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, according to the grand design, supposedly it's in our own self-interest for the Soviet police state to remain intact, to remain stable, and to maintain its death grip over the captive nations. Well, that kind of reasoning leads us next to the pages of one of the most influential newspapers in the world, the New York Times. On August 16, 1961, the Times ran this editorial: "We must seek to discourage anti-communist revolts in order to avert bloodshed and war. We must, under our principles, live with evil, even if by so doing we help to stabilize tottering communist regimes, and perhaps even expose citadels of freedom to slow death by strangulation." Is that shocking? Well, if you accept the premise of the grand design, it shouldn't be. It's then merely the cold and objective appraisal of our limited alternatives in this nuclear age. Well, let's bring this philosophy now to its ultimate conclusion and see what the world planners have to say about the future role of American sovereignty. Returning again to the words of Senator Fulbright, we find this most revealing book by him entitled Old Myths and New Realities. And bear in mind that this was written by the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, one of the most influential legislative committees in Washington. Now, on page 25, Senator Fulbright has this to say: "The problem for American policy is not in defining what we would like. It is rather how to live with the best we can get." And then on page 87, he continues, "The concept of national sovereignty has become in our time a principle of international anarchy. Our survival in this century may well turn out to depend upon whether we succeed in transferring at least some small part of our feelings of loyalty and responsibility from the sovereign nation to some larger political community." And then again he repeats back here on page 108, just so that no one misunderstands what he's trying to say. "The sovereign nation can no longer serve as the ultimate unit of personal loyalty and responsibility." Well, I think it's pretty obvious that many of our leaders in Washington long ago have transferred substantial portions of their personal loyalty and responsibility from the sovereign nation of the United States to the larger political community called the United Nations. In their own minds, it's likely that they consider themselves to be citizens of the world first and citizens of the United States second.
There have been differences between America and Europe. No doubt there will be differences in the future. But the burdens of global citizenship continue to bind us together. A change of leadership in Washington will not lift this burden. In this new century, Americans and Europeans alike will be required to do more, not less. Partnership and cooperation among nations is not a choice. It is the only way, the one way, to protect our common security and advance our common humanity.
In any decision where the interests of America are in direct conflict with those of the larger political community, you can be sure that America will wind up on the short end. Our former Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, in a lecture at Ohio Wesleyan University entitled "Toward World Unity," phrased it this way. What I initially propose involves an organization dedicated to the general welfare, the peace and order of mankind, and the assuming of an allegiance to this goal superior to that of any national allegiance. Well, returning again to the words of Walt Rostow, our former chief of the State Department Policy Planning Division, we find an unusually open and frank summary of the objectives of the grand design spelled out in his book, The United States in the World Arena, which incidentally was subsidized by the CIA. Way back here on page 549, Rostow says, "It is a legitimate American national objective to see removed from all nations, including the United States, the right to use substantial military force to pursue their own interests. Since this residual right is the root of national sovereignty, it is therefore an American interest to see an end to nationhood, as it has been historically defined." Well, Justice of the Supreme Court William Douglas wrote an essay entitled The Rule of Law in World Affairs, published in 1961 by the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions, which in turn, of course, is financed by another of those tax-exempt foundations, the Fund for the Republic. On page 32, Douglas wrote, "There is no reason for us to get tangled up in legalisms that march inexorably to the conclusion that total and complete sovereignty must be retained. For we now know that when that claim is pressed by all nations, everyone faces extinction in a nuclear holocaust." Well, that's a pretty precise summary of the grand design. In just 2 sentences, we're told that it's either world government or the bomb. Take your choice. By the way, the general theme and purpose of that pamphlet was to generate public support for increasing the power and prestige of the UN World Court, and also to lend support to a drive at that time for the repeal of the Connolly Amendment. Now, without getting too involved in this, I should explain that when the Senate ratified the UN statute of the International Court of Justice and agreed to commit the United States to accept the final decisions of the UN World Court, it was generally understood that the court would never meddle into our purely domestic affairs. But there were some who feared that in time the World Supreme Court would begin to find legalistic ways to declare that what we think is strictly our own business and no one else's is in a larger sense also the concern of mankind. So to prevent the World Supreme Court from extending its jurisdiction into our local affairs, the same way in which the federal Supreme Court has gradually assumed jurisdiction over what was once considered to be the local affairs of our own states, the Senate voted for an amendment to the statute proposed by Senator Tom Connolly. This amendment still stands and simply says that what is or is not a domestic affair of the United States will be determined by the United States, not by other nations or by the World Court itself. And so it's understandable why the grand designers have felt the need to generate greater public support for the International World Court and to repeal the Connolly Amendment. Now, on April 4th, 1960, Vice President Richard Nixon issued a statement under the official seal and letterhead of his office. And this statement read in part as follows. Many well-intentioned people have raised the basic question, why have an international court in the first place? The answer, in its simplest and bluntest terms, is that even nations that are friends are bound to have disputes. If those disputes are not settled by negotiation, the only alternative left is to settle them either by force or by law. At a time when the use of force means unleashing nuclear weapons which would destroy civilization, all sensible people agree that we must find some alternative to force for settling international disputes. Now that's really an incredible statement because in passing we should keep in mind that law also is force. If the courts don't have the police and the armies to back up their decisions with force if necessary, then there's no law. Law is force, legalized. And so, with this reality in mind, Mr. Nixon's statement continues. There are some today who believe that the prospect of the use of atomic weapons to settle international disputes is so terrible that we should set up a new all-powerful world organization which would have jurisdiction over disputes between nations. I disagree with this approach. I believe that rather than setting up a new international institution, we have to begin to use the one we already have. And then Vice President Nixon continues in his statement and concludes with strong assurances that we have nothing to fear and much to gain by repealing the Connolly Amendment. The international institution we already have, of course, is the United Nations. Most Americans good-heartedly accept the UN as a kind of farcical debating society. But I can assure you that the grand designers have other thoughts and plans. The May 1964 issue of the official UN Monthly Chronicle contains these glimpses into the future through the eyes of Secretary General U Thant. If we are to make the next step toward world authority and then onward to world government, it will be by the growth in authority and prestige of the United Nations and the International Court. Some form of regulatory international machinery of government in the true sense of the word is required. Such an authority cannot merely consist in a paper constitution and must be based in a certain degree of power. Well, a certain degree of power doesn't sound very menacing, but just how much power would it take to make the vision of a world government come true? Well, obviously, it would take whatever amount is required to be superior to that of any political subdivision beneath it. It would have to be so powerful that no nation could be able to challenge it without risking nuclear annihilation at the hands of the UN Army. But of course, if that happened, no one could possibly object because it wouldn't be called an act of war. It would be a peacekeeping maneuver by a peacekeeping force, and the mushroom cloud would rise from a peacekeeping bomb. Now, I know this must sound fantastic to some of you, so let's get back to the record. In 1961, the State Department published Document 7277, a booklet entitled Freedom from War, and the subtitle explains what it really is: the United States Program for General and Complete Disarmament in a Peaceful World. Now, this was our proposal submitted to the General Assembly of the United Nations for disarming and transferring to the UN complete control over our atomic weapons, our missiles, and our national Army, Navy, and Air Force as well. Everything except what we might need for a limited internal police function. Now, after 18 pages of detailed proposals, we finally discover in plain language the ultimate goal of our disarmament program. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is a direct quote. Disarmament would proceed to a point where no state would have the military power to challenge the progressively strengthened UN peace force. Well, of course, 1961 was a long time ago. And it's true that State Department publication 7277 is no longer our official position on disarmament. It was replaced by this one, Arms Control and Disarmament Agency publication, number 4, General Series 3, and as you can see, it's entitled Blueprint for the Peace Race. On page 33, we find the new position. The parties to the treaty would progressively strengthen the United Nations Peace Force established in Stage 2 until it had sufficient armed forces and armaments so that no state could challenge it. And so it has gone year after year, revision after revision. The basic objective of our disarmament proposals has been and is today the objective of the grand design, the creation of a true world government with sufficient military force to compel all nations, including our own, to obey. The January-February issue of Vista magazine, published by the United Nations Association, featured an exclusive interview with former President Eisenhower dealing with exactly this subject. The reporter, Mary Kersey Harvey, a senior editor of McCall's magazine, wanted to get the President's reaction to a proposal by Grenville Clark, which would establish a permanent UN World Army. After outlining the Clark proposal for President Eisenhower, here is what Miss Harvey reported. The President studied the above plan quickly, and, as I had expected, caught the ball and began to run with it. You'd have, he began to plan out loud, world marshals comparable to our U.S. marshals backed by armed forces. Non-compliance with UN law, and you send in the UN forces. He orchestrated this point at some length. And, too, he hammered away, the UN needs nuclear power. He bore down hard on the word nuclear. Take this example, he hurried on. You have two countries in a border argument. The UN orders the matter to be taken to the International Court. One or both of the disputants refuses to submit to compulsory arbitration. The UN, which by now has in its possession a fleet of submarines armed with nuclear warheads deployed around the world, orders one of the submarines to proceed to the area. The world is then told that if firing breaks out for any reason whatsoever, a tactical nuclear weapon will be delivered onto the disputed territory. If this threat fails to prevent armed conflict, you back it up with action. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the grand design for preventing nuclear war. Well, that's all the quotations and exhibits that time permits, which is in a way unfortunate because the examples I've used so far have been slightly top-heavy with Republicans. If I had more time, I could balance it out and then get everybody mad at me. But seriously, ladies and gentlemen, it's just as easy to find the sentiments expressed here within the top ranks of one major party as it is the other. The grand design has absolutely nothing to do with partisan politics. These men aren't nearly as much Republicans or Democrats as they are world politicians. They've got bigger things to occupy their minds than mere party labels. To them, partisan politics is only a game to amuse the masses who crave the showmanship of big national conventions, the excitement of partisan campaigns, and the satisfaction of casting a vote in the illusion that somehow they're really helping to decide the important issues of the day.
People talk to me about, the issue of Republican versus Democrat, as if they don't get it. And I say, look, here's the way you get it. It's organized crime. All you do is you call the Republicans the Genoveses, and you call the Democrats the Gambinos. The people at the top, they treat it like a crap game, like it's their crap game, like they're making lots of money. Occasionally, somebody at the table shoots each other, but the moment anything threatens their crap game, they all unite to protect it. They're both controlled by the same financial, economic, and corporate interests.
But with precious few exceptions. For the past 2 decades, the American voter has had to make his choice between Grand Designer A and Grand Designer B. It's always a source of amazement to me when I hear someone criticize our leaders for being confused in the area of foreign policy, of reversing their position, of bungling the job and not having any long-range goals. These men are not bungling the job. They're acting in accordance with a definite, well-thought-out plan. And they've been executing that plan with brilliant precision. We may or may not like the plan, but let's not kid ourselves into thinking that there isn't any. Now, I, for one, don't like the plan. And you may wonder why not. As you recall, earlier I said that when I was first exposed to the grand design, it seemed like a compelling argument. After all, each of these steps do seem to progress logically one to the other. So, having taken this much time merely to expound and explain a point of view which I no longer accept, I think the least I can do now is to offer the reasons for having changed my mind and to expose what I consider to be the fatal flaws. Ladies and gentlemen, there are at least 2 major fallacies that need to be understood if we're to overcome the arguments of containment, coexistence, accommodation, and ultimate merger with world communism. First of all, the premise behind these arguments is wrong. And you know you can't do much with a piece of logic if you start out with a faulty premise. The premise underlying the grand design is this. If all-out war should develop between major powers today, well, stop right there because we've already passed it. Back up all the way to the very first word, if. If. Ladies and gentlemen, when are we going to get it through our heads that all-out war is being waged against us right now and has been for a long time? And by all-out war, I mean total war, not just military war. We're so used to thinking in terms of the old-fashioned concepts of warfare in which the primary weapons were guns and bombs. We failed to realize that for the first time in history, we're facing an enemy that has mastered the concept of total warfare. World War III that rages around us right now is a political war, an economic war, a psychological war, a spiritual war, and a military war. But the military aspect is the least important of all. The only way that military strategy plays a role in the communist blueprint is in the form of guerrilla tactics, aimed at creating internal chaos and anarchy, to create the kind of conditions conducive for the quick seizure of power centers by a small group of organized and well-trained revolutionaries. That's the only kind of military strategy you'll find in the communist manuals, whether written by Lenin, Mao Zedong, or Che Guevara. And even this kind of limited military activity could never succeed without the simultaneous waging of non-military war. The communist guerrilla bands wouldn't stand a chance of succeeding in most countries without other communists operating secretly among the people to create the appearance of popular support, operating within the communications media to generate propaganda, and operating inside the government itself to create the necessary corruption, bickering, and apparent inefficiency to prevent that government from moving strongly against the guerrilla groups. In Cuba, for instance, almost everyone remembers that when Batista fled the country, an army of over 45,000 soldiers surrendered without a fight to only about 1,800 revolutionaries under Castro. But very few people were aware that the general who surrendered these forces was himself a member of the Communist Party in Cuba, a perfect example of the non-military strategy of infiltration and treason producing an apparent military victory. The favorite weapons of communist conquest are not engines of mass destruction in the hands of soldiers wearing a recognizable uniform. They are instead propaganda, the slanted view of history, the preaching of hatred to incite civil disorder, the tactics of internal subversion, treason, blackmail, the smear, political assassination, all committed by soldiers who wear no uniform and who claim to be loyal citizens of the target country marked for conquest from within. This is how communism has spread across the globe, not with invading armies or bombs, and it's extremely unlikely that they'd abandon this non-military strategy, which has been so effective for them right at the zenith of their success. Now, without a doubt, the bomb is the most powerful weapon in the communist arsenal, but it's as a psychological weapon, not as a military one. The Soviets have gained more by using the bomb as a psychological weapon than they ever could have using it as a military weapon. Under the constant threat of nuclear annihilation, we've accepted concessions, compromises, and defeats one after another, which would have been unthinkable without that specter of a giant mushroom cloud fixed deep in our subconscious.
We cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun, that could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
As a matter of fact, the bomb, as a psychological weapon, is being dropped on the American people every single day. Movies such as On the Beach, 7 Days in May, Dr. Strangelove, Failsafe, Planet of the Apes. These well-produced and entertaining movies have done really a professional job of strengthening, subconsciously at least, the premise of the grand design. Motion pictures, of course, aren't the only source of this conditioning of the public mind. Radio, TV, books, magazines, and newspapers have all played more than their part. The point is that the motion picture producers The TV commentators and the publishers who are so creative in their ability to convey to us all the horrors of death under a nuclear bomb, for some reason, never get around to portraying the fact that there are other horrible ways to die. We're shown the mushroom cloud, but not the mass graves or the torture devices that exist behind the iron and bamboo curtains. We're shown the charred bodies at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but not the emaciated bodies of the living dead in Soviet concentration camps, or the mutilated corpses of innocent civilians hacked to pieces by communist terrorists in one country after another. It's not that there aren't pictures like this, it's just that we're seldom allowed to see them, or be reminded of them through the accepted channels of mass communication. Now here are just two examples out of many that could be offered. Two documents that have been readily available for a long time. They contain material which almost has been totally denied to the American people. The first is a government pamphlet entitled "Lest We Forget," a pictorial summary of communism in action. It consists primarily of photographs smuggled out of Eastern Europe, providing documentary proof of communist atrocities committed in those lands in order to liquidate anti-communist opposition and to terrorize the people into submission. Now, there's no professional touch here, but the pictures still tell the story. We have the mass graves, the soundproof torture chambers.
We need a policy on torture, and it should be established soon before the next terrorist attack makes reasonable discussion impossible. The policy needs to be blindingly simple. Torture is always illegal, and those who use it will always be prosecuted. There's a back door, a weasel clause, if you will, there always is, but I'll get to that in a moment. We thought we had a policy. President George W. Bush stated it with commendable clarity during a visit to Panama in 2005.
We do not torture.
That turned out to be untrue. Waterboarding, for example, is a euphemism that's been with us for only a few years. The technique of simulated drowning, however, has a long and notorious history dating back to at least the Spanish Inquisition. When American soldiers used the technique in the Philippines more than 100 years ago, the euphemism of the day was the water cure. At any time and by any name, it was torture. Some prisoners of the Khmer Rouge, shackled hand and foot, broke bones in their wrists and ankles, so great were their struggles to escape the agonies of simulated drowning. Interviewer Scott Hennon of radio station WDAY was probably unaware of that historical trivia when, in 2006, he had this exchange with then Vice President Dick Cheney.
Would you agree dunking water is a no-brainer if it can save lives?
Well, it's a no-brainer for me, but for a while there I was criticized as being the Vice President for torture. We don't torture. That's not what we're involved in.
Well, we were involved in it, almost certainly will be again. And rather than debating how many angels can writhe on the head of a pin, we should establish procedures that will, at least, minimize its use. Defining torture should be relatively simple. If we object to a technique being used on a captured American, we shouldn't use it either. We also know that there are times when extraordinary circumstances, what is sometimes called the ticking time bomb scenario, will lead to the use of torture no matter what our public claims. Having said that, torture should be clearly and unambiguously against the law, as it is for those who safeguard our homes and streets domestically. Cases are thrown out of court because essential evidence was extracted under duress. Occasionally, brutal cops and corrections officers are even prosecuted and imprisoned. That has not led to the elimination of torture in our precincts and prisons, but it has been a deterrent. Let those who violate our stated national principles on torture be put on notice. It is against American law, no matter where or under what circumstances it's employed, and violations of that law will lead to prison. Is it possible that a threat to national security and the lives of many Americans may, at a subsequent trial, be determined to have justified the wisdom of that law? May a presidential pardon be warranted? Perhaps, but moral clarity and America's standing in the world demand that the burden of proof be on those who can find no alternative to torture.
And well, I guess you'd say they would be the pitiful victims of a deliberate program of mass starvation. You know, it's actually hard to believe that these children, even down to age 2, were starved in this fashion in communist forced labor camps. Well, now the other example is this pamphlet entitled On the Morning of March 15th, and it consists of photographs and factual descriptions of the results of a communist terrorist raid in northern Angola on the morning of March 15, 1961. Over 200 Europeans and 300 Africans were murdered on that one day alone. Over 50 widely separated places along a 400-mile front were attacked almost simultaneously. In most places, every man, woman, child, and infant, every living creature, even the cats and the dogs, were killed in the most brutal and sadistic manner imaginable. Now here are some of the less nauseating photographs, which hardly need description. You know, seeing that picture of the infant in the bassinet reminds me of one account which, forgive me, ladies, I must read, even though it sickens me to do so. A group of some 400 terrorists attacked the experimental farm at Mabridge. One of the few survivors of this attack, Manuel Lourenco Alves, relates what happened. The assault began at 6 in the morning, and all the houses on the farm, whether they belonged to Europeans, Africans, or mulattoes, were attacked simultaneously. The women were dragged out of their houses together with their children. In front of the mothers, the terrorists then proceeded to cut off the legs and arms of the children, and then started to play a grotesque game of football with the twitching bodies. The women and girls were then led away, stripped, raped, and cut up. Ladies and gentlemen, I've discussed these scenes and shown these pictures, not because of any desire to be sensational, believe me, but merely to help balance the scales of our judgment, to emphasize the almost forgotten fact nowadays that there are other horrible ways to die. Ways, as a matter of fact, that make the instant flash of a nuclear bomb seem merciful by comparison. And keep in mind that these other horrible ways to die are not the result of an event that happened almost a quarter of a century ago. We're talking about events that are happening right now to thousands of helpless human beings somewhere every day, millions every year. And we're not examining the unfortunate byproduct of an effort to bring an end to a long and bloody war. These incredible acts of brutality are the deliberate, premeditated works of men whose sole purpose is the destruction of human life and human values. But we're so saturated with peace propaganda and the specter of the mushroom cloud that we seldom have occasion to ponder these facts. And because of this one-sided exposure, millions of Americans have been conditioned without their even knowing it to fear the horror of nuclear war far more than they fear the terror of a communist peace. Some years ago, I happened to attend a meeting where several anti-communist refugees from behind the Iron Curtain were called upon to relate their personal experiences. Some of the questions that came from the audience were rather naive, I suppose, because finally one of the refugees spoke up and he said, "You know, you Americans have funny ideas about life under communism. Apparently you think there's a communist soldier standing on every street corner with a rifle and bayonet to keep the people in line. But this isn't so." He said, "Oh, sure, in the beginning there were plenty of soldiers and executions and deportations to slave labor camps, but we don't see much of that anymore. The open violence lasted only for about a year or a year and a half, and then the anti-communist leadership was liquidated. And now, to the casual observers, there's a great deal of apparent calm and freedom." For instance, he said, "I lived in the largest city in the country. We had a large park there directly across the street from a beautiful church." He said they left one church open, one in the entire country, primarily for guided tours of visiting Americans who had come to see if religion was being persecuted. He said, "Theoretically, anytime I wanted to, I could have gone into that park, stood on a bench, and spoken out against communism. Then I could have walked across the street into that church and knelt down in prayer, and I wouldn't have been arrested or bothered in any way. But you can be sure I did not do these things, because if I had, the very next day, the wheels of the bureaucracy would have begun to turn, and I would have been informed that my quota of food stamps had been cut, that my allotment for clothing and shoes had been reduced, that my allocation for living quarters had been downgraded, and finally, that my job assignment had been changed from the kind of work for which I'd been trained to menial labor at lower pay. So none of us did any of those things that we were theoretically entitled to do because of the tremendous power that the Communist Party had over our economic existence." And then he said something that I'll never forget. He hesitated for a moment, and weighing his words very carefully so as not to hurt our feelings, he said, "You know, I came to America expecting to find a nation of free men. But instead, I find exactly the same thing. Everywhere I look, I see men and women who know that communists are making headway in this country. They know that something must be done and that someone must stand up to them. But they themselves do nothing. They remain silent because they're afraid that if they speak out or take a stand publicly, it'll be bad for business. They may lose a client. They may even lose their jobs. Or perhaps they're receiving a regular government check and already are too dependent upon some of the very people and programs they know they should oppose." And then he said, "These men voluntarily have gone behind the Iron Curtain. They're already taken over by the communists. The only difference is that for the present at least, they can still get out any time they really want to, and we could not." I think there's a great lesson to be learned from that because it's true, isn't it? There are many men who are physically brave beyond any question when it comes to standing up against a tyranny that threatens with armies. Some of them carry the actual scars of battle to prove it. But when it comes to this new kind of war, they're lost to the fight. When there is no battlefield, when the weapons are not rifles or bombs but economic pressures, then who is your enemy? How do you fight? Where do you begin? It's precisely for these reasons that any modern dictatorship must have control over the economic sphere of all human activity. This was true of Nazism, it was true of fascism, it's true of communism, and it's also true of socialism. Regardless of what name we give it, total government control is by definition totalitarianism. That's what the word means. Now, Leon Trotsky, as you recall, was one of the original Bolsheviks who led the communist revolution in Russia. In 1937, Trotsky wrote a book entitled The Revolution Betrayed. And in this book, here's what he said. "The basis of bureaucratic rule is the poverty of society in objects of consumption. When there is enough goods in a store, the purchasers can come whenever they want to. When there is little goods, the purchasers are compelled to stand in line. When the lines are very long, it's necessary to appoint a policeman to keep order. Such is the starting point of the power of the Soviet bureaucracy. It knows who is to get something and who has to wait. And ladies and gentlemen, there's no better description than that of why the communists work to promote socialism. No matter whose definition you use, under socialism, those who run the government, and the communists are confident that in America they eventually will be the ones who do so, those who run the government will know who is to get something and who has to wait, and that represents control over human beings. What has all this to do with the communist revolution in America? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it has everything to do with it, because the building of socialism is the communist revolution in America. It represents the process whereby our country can be moved gradually toward communism without the people even being aware of it. No matter what grievance we may have, real or imagined, no matter what national problems we may face, the communists seize upon these as excuses to build socialism. They have one and only one solution for all problems: more government, and then more and more until it's total government. And forgive me for saying it one more time, total government is communism. If the government owns and controls all property, all means of production, and all avenues of commerce, then it controls all people. If we're dependent upon the government for our food, our clothing, our shelter, our jobs, our medical care, then we're far more effectively controlled by those who hold political power than if they stood over us with soldiers and weapons.
A new world order, a new world order, a new world order, a new world order.
We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders.
The affirmative task we have now is to actually create a new world order.
From the ashes of World War I, Adolf Hitler attempted to build a sinister new world order. Led by a so-called race of Aryan supermen, spreading a reign of terror unlike any the world had ever known. Many believed the Nazis conjured strange spirits and followed occult practices that had lain dormant in Europe for thousands of years. Now documents prove that their beliefs were based on a perversion of ancient pagan law, a twisting of mythic battles between forces of light and darkness, and a terrifying journey into a world ruled by mystics, madmen, and murderers.
And the hope that each of us has to build a new world order.
A new world order is coming into being.
I think the most important thing is for Barack Obama.
I think his task will be to develop an overall strategy for America in this period when really a new world order can be created.
I think a new world order is emerging, and with it the foundations of a new and progressive era of international cooperation.
But the burdens of global citizenship continue to bind us together. In this new century, Americans and Europeans alike will be required to do more, not less. Partnership and cooperation among nations is not a choice.
Yes, these men and their hypnotized followers call this a new order.
It is not new, and it is not order. I am asking your help in the tremendous task of informing and alerting the American people.
The consequences of the conflict in the Gulf reach far beyond the confines of the Middle East. Twice before in this century, an entire world was convulsed by war. Twice this century, out of the horrors of war, hope emerged for enduring peace. Twice before, those hopes proved to be a distant dream beyond the grasp of man. Until now, the world we've known has been a world divided, a world of barbed wire and concrete block, conflict, Cold War. Now we can see a new world coming into view, a world in which there is the very real prospect of a new world order. In the words of Winston Churchill, a world order in which the principles of justice and fair play protect the weak against the strong. A world where the United Nations, freed from Cold War stalemate, is poised to fulfill the historic vision of its founders. Even the New World Order cannot guarantee an era of perpetual peace, but enduring peace must be our mission. Our success in the Gulf will shape not only the New World Order we seek, but our mission here at home.
Good evening and congratulations, Walter, on receiving the World Federalist Association's Global Governance Award. For more than a generation in America, it wasn't the news until Walter Cronkite told us it was the news. Every night at 6 o'clock, we welcomed you into our living rooms and listened as you explained the complex events of the day. Whether it was the space race or the Vietnam War, presidential elections, or peace treaties, you were there, telling us in simple yet riveting prose what was happening. You became a trusted member of my family and of families across America. For decades you told us the way it is. But tonight we honor you for fighting for the way it could be. We honor you for lending your voice to the cause of human rights around the world and for your lifelong commitment to international human rights law. From your reporting on the Nuremberg trials to your work with the WFA campaign to end genocide, you have stirred our consciences and challenged all of us to live closer to the words of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. So thank you, Walter. Thank you for inspiring all of us to build a more peaceful and just world. We are still listening to your every word. And with your continuing leadership, we can sail across these unnavigated seas into the 21st century. And there's no better captain I can imagine than you. Thank you.
The Norman Cousins Global Governance Award, Walter Cronkite. World government is the structure necessary for global justice. You, sir, have been a lifelong advocate of this principle, and it is appropriate, therefore, that we present you with this amethyst shield.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And there are many of us here who had wished back a couple of decades ago that we had been addressing you as Mr. President in a slightly different environment. And thank you, Mrs. Annan, for those lovely words you spoke. I will treasure them, and I'm greatly honored, quite obviously, by the Norman Cousins Global Governance Award. I'll try to get it right, since I will be referring to it frequently, of course, from now on. First, there are two reasons, really, why I'm particularly grateful and honored by this award. The first, I believe, as Norman Cousins did, that the first priority of humankind in this difficult era is to establish an effective system of world law that will assure peace with justice among the peoples of all the world. But second, I feel rather sentimental about this award and this organization, because half a century ago, Norman Cousins offered me a job as the spokesman and the Washington lobbyist for the really nascent organization called World Federalists. I was honored. He and Oscar Hammerstein met me in the Waldorf and twisted my arm quite vigorously, get me to take the job, to take the place of Ted Waller, who was the first lobbyist and a noted supporter of the World Federalist movement. I chose instead, it turned out, to continue in the world of journalism. For many years, I did my best to report on the issues of the day with as much fairness as I possibly could, in objective a manner as possible to achieve. When I had my own strong opinions, I tried to put them aside for the moment in the interest of fairness. I didn't communicate my hope to my audience. Now, however, my circumstances are considerably different. I'm in a position to speak my mind, and by God, I'm going to do it. You know, those of us who are living today can truly influence the future of civilization. We can influence whether our planet is going to live or die, whether it's going to drift into chaos and violence, or whether through a monumental educational and political effort, we will achieve a world of peace under a system of law where individual violators of that law are brought to justice. For how many thousands of years now have we humans been what we insist on calling civilized? And yet, in total contradiction, we also persist in the savage belief that we must occasionally at least settle our arguments by killing each other. While we spend much of our time and a great deal of our treasure in preparing for war, we see no comparable effort in establishing peace. Meanwhile, emphasizing the sloth in this regard, those advocates who work for world peace by urging a system of world law and order, world government, if you please, are called impractical dreamers. Those impractical dreamers are entitled, it seems to me, to ask their critics, what is so darn practical about war? First, we Americans are going to have to yield up some of our sovereignty. That's going to be, to many, a bitter pill. It would take a lot of courage, a lot of faith, a lot of persuasion to them to come along with us on this necessity. Most important, we should sign and ratify the Treaty for a Permanent International Criminal Court. That is now at the core of the World Federalist Movement's drive. That court will enable the world to hold individuals accountable for their crimes against humanity. Their leader, Pat Robertson, has written in a book a few years ago that we should have a world government, but only when the Messiah arrives. He wrote, literally, any attempt to achieve world order before that time must be the work of the devil. Well, join me. I'm glad to sit here at the right hand of Satan.